Welcome to Liberty and Logos, Episode 7. I'm Bellamy Fitzpatrick, and joining me is Amory Devereux. And we are entitling this one, Violence, Values, and Justice. How are you doing today, Amory?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
Yeah.
And we've got the light and dark dynamic continuing, and I'm back in my rightful place as the arch-villain.
Yeah, actually, I was just chastised shortly before we started this by my partner saying, why don't you set up a proper lighting setup? It seems like you're going to be doing this show regularly. There's no reason not to do this. And I had no excuses. So perhaps next time, the very next time we record, I might actually be out of town visiting my family. But the one after that, I will have no excuses not to have a proper lighting setup. So maybe the same will pass along to you. Right?
Yeah, I hope so.
But quite a lot has happened. It's been a real transformation since the last time we did this. We've had the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests that in some cases have led to riots and all sorts of chatter from the official and unofficial chattering classes about what all of this means. And I actually want to do a solo episode within the next week, we'll say, about the Seattle Autonomous Zone. So I'm not so much interested in addressing that right here. But, if we touch on it, that's fine. But I guess I'll kick it to you first about what you make of all this.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a big false division being made between, protests and riots. And that's to suit various people's agenda. Various people want to say that protests are okay, but riots are wholly not okay. And there's people that would say the opposite. And I think that what we're looking at is four different groups of people, which some of which are operating at the same time and in union. But I think that there are genuinely concerned protesters who want to put instances of racial discrimination and especially violence and thuggery by the authorities into the foreground. And I think a lot of those people are swept up into the Black Lives Matter banner, but I think they're well-intentioned people. So they're the first. Then I see that there are kind of provocateurs, probably from nefarious organizations and including government forces, police forces, that are infiltrating those protests in order to destabilize them, make them violent, and then find an excuse to have a retaliation by the police onto them. Mm-hmm. I also think that the Antifa movement, if you want to call it that, is kind of latching onto this opportunistically, wanting to push things forward. They thrive on the fact that basically any situation that explodes to lots of violence is good for them and their agenda. And then I do think that some of the footage I've seen shows a fourth group, which is misguided, pathological individuals and groups who are just doing looting and random acts of violence on people, getting swept up in things. You could call it the sort of crazy gang, if you like. But that's the sort of four categories that I see. I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, I think we have to right away say both Black Lives Matter and Antifa are not formal organizations. I understand Black Lives Matter does have something of a leadership organization, but ultimately it's decentralized and anyone can call themselves part of it. And it's more like a signaling mechanism than anything else. Antifa also has no central organization. There are local chapters, but it's more of a tactical orientation, and I don't think it is possible really to generalize about either of those groups. You can't even quite call them groups, right? Tendencies.
Okay.
Or if we generalize about them, we have to acknowledge that we're generalizing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, sure, those lines are blurred, and it is definitely difficult for any individual clip, let's say, to say, okay, what's going on, and assign people to these four groups. But I just wanted to say that, I don't want anybody to think that in the comments that I make on this, that I'm taking all of it under one monolithic umbrella and saying,
Sure.
this is what I think of it. I mean, as far as protest is concerned, I think it's fine and can even be quite effective as long as you realize that the main objective that you're trying to achieve is just to be visible and for your point of view to be disseminated and spread out there.
Yes.
And it's when the protest goes to the level of trying to make demands of authorities, legislative, administrative, and law enforcement that I think it becomes a little bit pointless, because I can't really think of an example of that ever being successful.
Well, it depends what you mean by successful. I mean, certainly people succeed in reforming the state, reforming the establishment in myriad ways. I mean, the history of civilization is a history of reforms, and often the powers that be are pressured. They need to maintain some semblance of representing people. But the question is whether that fulfills really valuable long-term goals. And I think you and I would have a lot of criticisms of that, so maybe that's what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Like changing things to the point where you no longer have to make the protest because your demands are sufficiently met, and then you're trying to maybe tune finer details.
Sure.
But as far as the rioting is concerned, this is what I think, even when it's not being done by provocateurs or people who are sort of at the nihilistic end of the Antifa, shall we say, spectrum, who just causing this kind of violence for its own sake or to advance their own particular ends, I don't see how that achieves absolutely anything at all.
So I have a few things I want to say, but I want you to first clarify, because there are almost certainly going to be people listening to this who feel positively about the idea of rioting from an insurrectionary anarchist point of view. And so I want you to, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but basically say why you think that this is ineffective.
Well, if you are an insurrectionary anarchist, then you probably want some kind of revolution, or you think that even sort of individual acts of violence can help weaken the state, delegitimize the state, or something to those ends. And
propaganda of the deed.
Propaganda of the deed, exactly. Yeah. So I don't care about a revolution. I'm really only interested in actions which affect people's minds, and not that the propaganda of the deed wouldn't, but I don't think it leads to the right kind of changes in people's minds. I think we need to move away from violence. This is something that we'll get into when we open up the theoretical aspect of the main topic. But I've written at length, I think, that I don't want a revolution. Mm-hmm. I'm the sort of peace and love guy, I guess.
Right. So a few things, and hopefully I can bring it all in the order I want. I do think there is some value in protests, but I think the value is rather narrow. Interestingly, this a few days ago, partially in preparation for doing this show, I was listening to the anarcho-capitalists Tom Woods and Dave Smith talking about this, and they ended up coming very hard against the riots, which I expected, but also quite hard against the idea of protest itself, saying sort of, what's the point? You're just begging the state. And I thought that was rather narrow-minded, in the sense that I do think with the media that we have now, the large portion of it is so controlled and colonized by the establishment that it's basically useless, except to just understand what the powers that be want the narrow channels of opinion to be. The alternative media, which they were basically saying, if you want to get a message out, why not do it in alternative media? But the problem with that is that it's so self-selected, and it's so at the point now that we're just in these narrow information tunnels, and there's actually data about how narrow people's information tunnels are, that it's, I think, often the case that the only way someone would even understand that a particular issue, not this one because it was so heavily publicized, but in general, that a particular issue even exists and that people have an opinion about it, would be to encounter some kind of public demonstration of a kind. And so in that sense, I think there is a function of it. The problem being that almost always these protests are a way of petitioning the state, which I think is a dead end for reasons that will probably be obvious to anyone who's listening to this show. One interesting thing about the rioting dynamic is how often, and I've seen this for years now, people frame the effectiveness of riots in terms of getting reform. And I've seen this from a variety of left-wing positions, from a sort of black radical position, from even a kind of soft-core pseudo-insurrectionary anarchist position that, well, when we cause enough destruction, essentially, we'll get the police reforms that we want. And so it's odd to see this act that, on the one hand, is this kind of overt physical aggression against the corporate state, be interpreted as yet another form of especially feisty petitioning of the state. So that argument for it, I don't think makes a lot of sense. Now, people who are familiar with my past projects know that I'm quite skeptical of the insurrectionary anarchist position, but I want to try to steelman it because you referred to it as people who want a social revolution. And I think a lot, not all, but a lot of insurrectionary anarchists would say, oh no, we understand that this kind of social revolution of the old left 19th century variety doesn't work because it leads to a new state. The vanguard of the revolution becomes the new tyrant, which we've seen over and over again, to the point that I think the historical evidence for it is very clear. And so what they imagine is a kind of highly decentralized, informal creation of ungovernable zones that doesn't allow, ideally, any new authority to come in to take the vacuum, because no formal organization is created that would have the logistical and the logistical capacity to become that new authority figure.
That sounds a bit to me like scorched earth, really. I mean, and I'm reminded of some of the individualist anarchists that I encountered around about 10 years ago, who would come out of rhetoric like, it doesn't matter if basically everything is destroyed and messed up as long as there's no state, and it kind of defeats the point. And I think that the other thing that I just thought of, which maybe you can comment on briefly, is that it's a very state-centric mode of praxis, because it's only focusing on, in this zone, is there strong state governance, weak state governance, or no state governance. It doesn't look at all the other forms of violence and heteronomy.
Such as what, sort of mob violence, or what do you?
Well, yeah, you've got mob violence, you've got intrafamilial violence,
sure.
All kinds of things like that. So for a long while, I've tried to steer things away from merely just being sort of state, non-state,
Yeah, and I think, although he was not an insurrectionary anarchist, he was an anarcho-communist, but a lot of this can be encapsulated in that famous phrase of Bakunin that the urge to destroy is also a creative urge. And this idea that a lot of it comes from this idea that developed, I don't know if it originally developed in the insurrectionary anarchist tendency, but it definitely was taken up by it, that there's such an aversion to anything that looks like prefiguration, with the idea that if we were to try to prefigure, it's also kind of, in a way, it's sort of a postmodern idea that we're so controlled by these dominant discourses that are authoritarian and that paradigmatically limit our ways of thinking so much that if we tried to prefigure what we wanted a liberated world to look like, we would inevitably screw it up by subtly encoding these authoritarian tendencies that we don't even notice. And so the idea that we could just kind of imagine what the world is going to be like and try to build the new in the shell of the old is a mistake. Therefore, you just want to focus on attack, intellectual and physical, just to raise what exists, and that then when we reach that kind of event horizon, we'll know what to do. And I think that this is a huge mistake. I think it's odd because it seems like a kind of extreme pessimism about human ability, the aversion to prefiguration, but it also has this, to me, absurd optimism about human ability that we would just be able to spontaneously create a good world, as soon as we sort of wiped the ashes out of our hair. And we do see stuff like disaster utopianism and people really helping each other out in times of crisis, but Go, please.
One of the interesting points that have just come to my mind, which is a nice segue into our main topic, is that this resistance of any kind of blueprint, which you just spoke about, seems to me to smack of either an incomplete or incoherent set of values, or I think in many cases, no real values at all. Okay, so if you're happy to go into the main topic via that segue.
I have more I want to say about this, but I think I probably should just put it in my solo video because I could go on about it a bit. So, yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to start with a little thesis of mine, which brings together the first two of our principles, which is violence and values. My first premise is that the only way to limit violence in a given place and to transition to an almost entirely violence-free culture is to make heavy use of values by establishing what they are, and then secondly that they need to be nurtured and monitored, and where necessary, and which will probably be necessary in nearly every case, defended. And that brings in a little key distinction between violence as the initiation of force and defense, where you might take up arms, but to defend yourself, your kin, your community, and those aforementioned values. So those are my two premises that relate values and violence. What do you make of those?
Well, okay, so this sounds a fair bit like the non-aggression principle. Is that's fair to say? In terms of defining violence, or?
Yeah, the second point takes the same kind of idea, the same distinction between violence initiated and defense. But of course, most users of the non-aggression principle are not that willing to come forward and say that everything is broken down into values, which is a far more, I would say, moralist and spiritual point of view compared to the sort of vert fry economics of the libertarian right, which is nearly always based in property rights, natural rights, this kind of thing. So there's a definite. It's not the same thing. This is not really a very clearly right libertarian point of view.
Yeah, I see the point you're making. I think, again, because this is what I like to do, just to steelman their position a bit, I think they would readily say, oh, we're not saying that libertarianism as a system is a complete value system it's deliberately this kind of minimalistic one that's just supposed to be about political relations, and it's not a whole philosophy of life or something
Sure,
like that.
It's another form of no blueprints, just principles, or something like that.
Yeah.
So my main point there is the first premise, really, that if you're going to get anywhere towards a non-violent paradigm, we live in a very violent paradigm. Many of us, I say us, like myself, you, and some of the viewers of the show, are interested in moving to a non-violent paradigm, or to limit violence as much as possible. And I think that has to be done with respect to values. And I suppose at this point, if I'm to bring in what I'm seeing in these protests that erupt into violence for reasons other than provocateurs and being sort of derailed by Antifa and the police, it's like, what values are these people putting forward? It's not clear to me. I don't want to get too distracted into the actual Black Lives Matter position, but what I don't see from them is, here's a clear value and we're going to just defend that value. It's more about attacking what they see as being wrong in the current in the status quo, and it's not really with respect to values, and it's very often what they're attacking is a sort of straw man version of the reality anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of what you said there. Insofar as they have a central committee, as I was talking about before, they actually put out demands that do reflect some values, but I imagine there's a huge disconnect between what that central group, which I assume is composed of intellectuals and longtime activists, and the people on the ground who are identifying with it. So just to take one example, my understanding is that central committee has advocated for things like the abolition of the nuclear family, which I don't imagine many of the people on the ground either want or even are aware of. So, and I could be wrong about that, but that's just my impression, because I don't think that sort of thing would actually be very popular. I think what would be advocated by a lot of those is they would articulate it as the ending of systemic racism, increases in so-called equity, which is this kind of loosey-goosey term that doesn't mean what I think a lot of people think it means. And what I see as the major problems with this is my sort of familiar refrain that I don't see value in movements that aim to preserve this sort of mass society, which is this taken for granted yet totally insane idea that you can have hundreds of millions of people living in a society that is more or less centrally organized and that is supposed to provide a satisfying way of life for all of these people who differ in their preferences, their abilities, their hopes, their dreams, their cultural preferences. And I agree with you that what I'm looking for is to transition to a very different kind of world. You're talking about it in terms of violence. I would use slightly different language like coercion, domination, exploitation, but I think we mean essentially the same sort of thing. And what I think is interesting about the Seattle Autonomous Zone, which again I don't want to get too into, is it is an effort to say, hey, maybe we need a small consensual society. And the reason that I think it can't work the way that they're doing it, even though there are some aspects about it that I admire, is you can't just sort of scratch build something like that with a whole bunch of people who don't know each other, who come together. And I admire the sort of boldness of experimentation, but I think the way for this to happen would be something that is slower, more holistic, and that is based on some sort of prior existing bonds, shared values, some sense of shared culture.
Mm-hmm. There is a sort of side question, I think, that relates to violence, and I think that this is something I'd like to throw up because I'd like to hear your point of view on it. It's not something we've talked about very recently, and also, viewers may have something to say about it as well. And this is the sort of where we can draw the line between argumentation ethics and violence. So some people would say that if you say a particular controversial opinion, then that sort of is a violent act in itself. Mm-hmm. And sure. My concern here is that neither the offended party nor the alleged offender can wholly rely on their subjective viewpoint to be able to say whether or not something that was said is or is not violent, verbal violence. And I think that the only way to solve this issue in a philosophical sense is to make reference to principles. And I wondered, in your mind, which principles you use to answer that question.
Yeah, I think this is a relevant point because one of my issues with the non-aggression principle, as many right libertarians would define it, is that they circumscribe it to mean physical aggression against a person or their rightfully owned property. And I do think there is such a thing as psychological violence. Some people know that I'm on my way to becoming a psychotherapist, and I also spent a fair bit of time working at a place that dealt with, it was a not-for-profit related to domestic violence. And what many people will tell you who either have been abused or have worked in that field is that most people who have experienced both physical and psychological abuse say that the psychological abuse was worse for them.
Yeah.
So I think there is such a thing as inflicting psychological violence on people. And that's why I don't think it is charitable or reasonable to just completely laugh off this idea that, of the sort of archetypal social justice warrior yelling that, being exposed to ideas is violence. I mean, I understand why people laugh at that image, but it contains at least a kernel of truth, and I would say more than a kernel. But I also am very much a stubborn, stern, steadfast believer in freedom of speech and open inquiry, which some radicals don't like because they say this is a liberal idea. And I think, of course, there's a weak conception of that in terms of the relationship between a citizen, subject, and their state, and that's not what I'm talking about. I think any healthy society, any healthy culture needs to have some version of public forums in which ideas can freely be aired and freely listened to and engaged with or not. And so for a society to be healthy, it needs to have a culture of self-criticism and some kind of means to reform itself and ward off toxic ideas and tendencies and be able to evolve and adapt to new conditions. So whether that would be some sort of literal public square or certain media, as a Luddite, I don't imagine a future with the internet or something like that. And but there would be some means, even if it's just people coming to, a gathering circle or circulating some kind of paper publications about ideas. So I think, I'm taking a long time to answer your question, but I think that the distinction would be something like verbal harassment and hounding someone. So if you're engaged in dialogue with someone and you express an idea or a value that that person finds offensive, they would have the natural right to withdraw from engaging with you, whether that means, literally just walking away or saying, hey, please leave my home or something like that. And continuing past any reasonable point where you're just trying to maybe clear up miscommunication or misinterpretation, if the wish for the person not to engage with you is clear and unequivocal, then I think going beyond that, you are psychologically harassing that person. I do think that in the public square that I'm talking about, that would not make sense. Offensive ideas have to be heard. I think George Orwell was the one who said something like, if freedom of speech means anything, it means the freedom to tell people something they don't want to hear, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And then the exception to that is some kind of immediate incitement to violence, like a credible incitement to violence.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with those. And if anyone has any other nuances that they would like to chime in with, I think that would be a great thing to send us. So please feel free to do that. Yeah, so I think what I'd like to explore a little bit, and this will be our first pass, and we'll go over these probably in a number of episodes, which is about different types of justice. I should briefly say that I'm currently writing a book on the 7 cardinal virtues, one of which is justice, so I have a particular interest in this right now. Yeah. And it also ties in with conversations that you and I were having when I visited you. And I think there was enough of a disagreement there for us to find some interesting new ground. And I've got 4 sort of headings here of preventative justice, which is designed to prevent people from doing unjust things. Retributive justice, whereby some kind of, if you like, retribution is enacted on the perpetrator because it's the just thing to do. Restitutional justice carries more of like an economic element, but could also be in a sort of there are people who would argue this in a moral sense as well, to restore things which have been lost through unjust acts. And then sort of cohesive justice, where the main objective of the justice system or enforcement is to keep the community or the polity together, and to especially keep them grounded in their own particular principles of justice. So before I set out the particular sort of punishment theory that I wanted to do a short reading from today, I wondered if you had any sort of initial comments on that point.
Yeah, I guess the only thing would be that I think most people would say any justice theory that they were putting forward would contain some element of the cohesive, in the sense that the idea is to keep the community satisfied that they will be able to continue to have a harmonious or at least semi-harmonious existence in spite of some kind of deviation, some kind of transgression. But please go ahead.
Yeah, so the theory that I want to read from today is developed by a right libertarian called Walter Block. It's taken from an essay he wrote called Radical Libertarianism, Applying Libertarian Principles to Dealing with Unjust Government, Part 1. And it is from an anthology called The Reason Papers 27. It's a very long essay. It has a lot of different sections. One of the ones that I think is most important and relevant to today's discussion is where he sets out what he calls libertarian punishment theory. Okay, and what he's doing is he's suggesting that the purpose of justice here is both restitutional, preventative, and in some cases retributive. And he mentions the phrase two teeth for a tooth. My own sort of personal description of that would be 3 eyes for an eye. Okay. So first of all, he describes a situation in which he says, suppose I steal a TV set from you. Quote, surely the first thing that should occur when I am captured is that I be forced to return to you my ill-gotten gains. So based on the first of 2 teeth, I must return this appliance to you. But this is hardly enough. Merely returning the TV to you, its rightful owner, is certainly no punishment to me, the criminal. All I have been forced to do is not give up my own TV to you, but to return yours to you. Thus enters the second tooth. What I tried to do to you should instead be done to me. I took your TV set, therefore as punishment, you should be able to get mine or some monetary equivalent. This is the second tooth. Okay, close quote. So then he goes on to say that because this is only the beginning of the attempt to turn the future back into the sort of place it would have been had the crime not occurred. And he says that is the ultimate goal of libertarian justice, defines it as sort of in an absolute sense impossible, but that it should be seen as the goal, and therefore you get as close to it as possible. And then he says that by coming into your house to steal your home, you, the victim, didn't know what he was capable of or intended, so you may have been scared half to death, in addition to him making off with your property. And where does the compensation come, the making whole for that particular element? And in terms of a punishment, there should be some way to impose the fear that the perpetrator caused in his victim onto him. He speculates, this is not a sort of, it doesn't seem like the most kind of definitive part of his paper, but he speculates that people who commit crimes that involve violence be forced to play Russian roulette, where the number of bullets and the total number of chambers is determined by the severity of the threat imposed. So if you break into someone's house, you steal their TV, you threaten them with a club, maybe, it would be not as bad as if he sort of ties you up. You've got a firearm that you are a very visibly violent and intimidating person. So this risk is increasing, and that the punishment is adjusted accordingly. Finally, just one more thing about this theory is he talks about how this will apply to something like murder. And he says, well, because we don't have a machine that can take the life of the murderer and put it into the life of the victim, what we can do in its place is that the life of the murderer becomes forfeit. He took a life, he owes a life, and then if since it cannot be transferred to the dead victim, it can be given over to their kin to do with as they wish. So whatever they want to do with the caught and convicted murderer's life is up to them. So that is a sort of very quick and broad overview of this libertarian theory of justice, which I think most closely describes my own position. You had some things to say about it a few weeks ago. I just wondered if you'd had a chance to develop those thoughts anymore.
So just to fill out the picture for people who may not be familiar with Walter Block or anarcho-capitalism in general, when there are these references to courts and sort of systematic punishment, this wouldn't be a centralized state court. It would be some sort of private law society where you would have actually privatized, individualized, decentralized court system that people could engage in an almost consumer type relationship, right?
Yeah, and also by this model, although maybe not necessarily by my opinion, by this model, the enforcement, the detectives that find and bring the accused to this justice would also be private provided. Right. That's not necessarily my view. I have some different thoughts on that for another time. Yeah.
So here's, I guess, where maybe I'll show my leftist roots. And although so many left anarchists react to my media as if I'm some sort of right-wing monster or fascist entryist, I was amused. One of the anarcho-capitalist shows that I went on, they had occasion to say, I can really see how you came from left anarchism. So maybe that will happen again here, which is that I guess I have concerns about, and I will say right now that my thoughts on this are embryonic. I don't know exactly where I stand with a sort of theory of justice, and that has to do with the fact that for a long time I was an amoralist. I didn't believe in moral realism, and I was also somewhat averse to prefiguration, never in that kind of totalizing way that I described earlier. But because of that combination of things, I only recently had to really seriously engage with, okay, I am a moral realist. I need to develop an ethical system, and I need to imagine how that would translate into a broader political system and the kind of world I would like to see. So take these as incomplete thoughts. And I have concerns about, most obviously, something like Walter Block's description of playing this sort of Russian roulette game where there would be this kind of festival of punishment and an idea that justice might involve a kind of revenge that would activate and feed people's sadistic urges. And, I'm enough of a Nietzschean to recognize that people have these aggressive drives. They have these drives for power and domination, and that we're never going to get rid of those. We have to work with them. And it's even dangerous in a lot of ways to suppress people's ambition, pride, aggression. You have to find ways to channel it to be as harmless as possible. I guess it's not clear to me that giving someone control and discretion over a murderer's body and being is a good thing. I mean, this could drive someone to torture someone, to enslave them, to do things that might be satisfying in the short term, but which in the long term would end up brutalizing someone psychologically without them even necessarily realizing it. And here's where I'll maybe sound even more leftist. I would want to look to solutions that would restore harmony as much as possible. I think for sure restitution is part of that. I think exile and outlawry, where you basically excommunicate someone from the community and they basically have left the moral community, are sometimes options that would be appropriate. But I also think efforts at restoration and even a kind of therapeutic approach can be appropriate in a lot of circumstances. So this idea that we deter and prevent undesirable behavior by having a very liberal attitude, liberal in the sense of loose and free attitude toward punishment, I don't know that that's the best thing. I know, and I'm afraid I don't have the data to draw on, but I'm familiar with the idea that it's not clear that retribution functions that well as deterrence, and that a lot of people who engage in criminal activity now end up engaging in recidivism. They go on to continue to do crime. Now, a lot of that has to do with the social circumstances that we have, where a lot of people feel that they can't get anywhere in the world without engaging in criminal behavior, and we also brutalize people through prison, which leaves them in a sorry state to reintegrate into the community. So in a very different world, maybe retribution would function as deterrent, but if we respond to physical aggression by harming the aggressor and then sort of putting them back into society, it's not clear to me that that's going to leave either the injured party or the injuring party better off as compared to restitution and some intervention by skilled mediators, people who would play the role of sort of community harmonizers and intellectual leaders within the community, trying to bring the people together to work out why it happened and what pathological drives brought that in the first place. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot of there I would actually agree with, and I think perhaps the easiest way to fully qualify what I'm saying is that if your viewpoint you described as embryonic, I guess mine is kind of like
fetal.
in the second trimester or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
And I definitely see that, you know, some forms of retributive justice could be so traumatizing that they just sort of break the person rather than fix them, and also give, as you said, give nothing to the wronged party. And so I think that there's a lot of what you said that I would want to see how it could be integrated. I think the one thing that brings us full circle. The one thing about retributive, strong, strict justice, which acts to be in the form of retribution and by implication sort of prevention, because it's so strict, what it does do, I think, is defend values a little bit better, certainly in any kind of transition period, because we live in a very violent dominated world, we live in a very unjust world, and I feel that if you've got your little autonomous zone or enclave, consentient society, whatever set up, and you want to bring in people to that, yes, they would have, as you said when you talked before about the values, it would be a very good idea to make sure people are kind of largely singing from the same song sheet. Mm-hmm. But of course, there is always this chance for conflict to arise and for quote unquote crimes to occur. And I feel that if you start out with something that's relatively strict, maybe even a little bit stricter than you would need, you're on the right lines, and then maybe it can be adjusted downward in according with these ideas of having these experts, this therapeutic element, the sort of almost correctional side of things, sort of acting as a kind of check and balance on that. So I think that's something we'll probably come on to again, but I don't have anything else to add at this point, really.
And I agree with what you said just now, that it's not like we can get from here to there in any immediate sense. And I think when a group is able to carve out let's call it a semi-permanent autonomous zone, that
a SPAS.
Yeah, which I believe is the name actually of a band, I believe. You have to fiercely defend it. And that actually goes in general for the kind of world that we live in now and what one can reasonably expect in the near future, as much as we're talking about trying to reduce violence. I have no illusions about the fact that anyone trying to secede and create a consentient community, that community has to be able to wield as much defensive violence as possible, because it's going to be targeted by both the forces of Leviathan and the sort of non-state sort of warlord type forces and everything. So unfortunately, those who want to be free have to be able to wield tremendous violence, if necessary, defensively themselves.
Do you want to start with JD?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so
you have that handy, yeah.
Yeah, we received an email from a JD, and they write, quote, "Both of you are clearly rooted in reason and rationality."
This is an excerpt, you should say.
Yes, it is an excerpt, yeah. Both of you are clearly rooted in reason and rationality, and it seems as though all of your positions assume that this is the way the world works. I'm a bit skeptical here, and while I feel like this is also how I function, it doesn't seem to be the case that this is how most people interact with the world, or how change occurs. I feel like oftentimes radicals came to their politics through a long process of reasoning, logic, and thought, and then assume that if it happened for them, it should and could happen for everyone else. However, if we look at moments when individuals and groups have rejected the logic of capital or attempted to break away from existing forms of domination, it seems as though it happens almost randomly or instinctually. If a black kid is shot and folks start rioting the next day, they didn't all just simultaneously achieve consciousness that police are bad and property rights are bullshit. Maybe some of them have had these thoughts before, but probably not all. Gilles Dauvet, this is a thinker, said something to the effect of, people don't become aware of their situation and then act, they become aware of their situation through acting against it. I guess what I'm getting at here is that I'm not sure that thought always precedes action, which seems to be the position you two hold. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So this is from Julian Langer, who some of you may know. He is an author who's written a few books that have been published through Little Black Cart, and he also has a very active blog. And this is his commentary after having watched the first 5 episodes. He says, the first thought of mine is one regarding reasoning, which you both seem to put a great deal of faith in. I personally have found the world to be an unreasonable space, with individuals as manifestations of the world being basically unreasonable, when not adopting some sort of encoding to provide comforts to the despair of unreasonableness. I wonder what you would think of exploring the avenues of philosophy from a position that differs from that of the certainty that reasoning, capital R, supposedly provides, through the method of logic, which is similar to that described by Shestov in the statement, quote, the business of philosophy is to teach man to live in uncertainty. Man who is supremely afraid of uncertainty and who is forever hiding himself behind this or the other dogma. More briefly, the business of philosophy is not to reassure people but to upset them, end quote. John Moore, who's a green anarchist, now deceased, primitivist concept of bewilderness fits this quite nicely.
Yeah.
Following from this, I find the type of position that you both put forward, that, quote, we are not free and must become free, end quote, far too reassuring and also incompatible with Amory's statements regarding free will, which is something I share in an experience of. Is not the real tragedy that we are free, have always been free, can only be free, and that people have collectively embraced the bad faith narrative that they are not, to such a point of normalization that it has become near totalitarian?
Yeah, well, to answer both these two very gratefully received pieces of feedback at the same time, I think my own view is that perhaps I have a sort of rational philosophic bias that's kind of left over, but I'm always trying to kind of move away from that. And have been for some time. Actually, it was you, Bellamy, that inspired me most at the sort of beginning of our shared conversations on our spiritual journeys. You pointed out that perhaps I was going more on instinct than I ought to be, and not enough on sort of some kind of process of reasoning.
Right.
And you mentioned how Jung would say that you're on the right lines when a rationalist perspective, your empirical experience, your intuition and other faculties are
your
all
emotions.
Your emotions as well are all sort of in line, and that's when you can be more sure that you're on the right lines. And so I don't necessarily think that I've got that fully automatized, but it's something that whenever it occurs to me to do, I try and strive towards. And on the back of that, I still feel, with my observation, which is the main empirical part here, that people are not behaving in very reasonable ways because they're not thinking enough, not because it's their kind of default mode or relates to some human nature. So when we talk about freedom and how people might attain it, and why people are not so engaged with it, I think it's because they are probably not thinking enough, full stop.
This is a kind of perennial criticism that I get, and I thought it was well put by both of the respondents, and I thank them both for their contributions. But a perennial criticism that I get of being excessively rational and assuming that you can just sort of think your way out of the situation that we're in within Leviathan. I don't think that you can just think your situation out. I also, since I became interested in spirituality, more than ever, I recognize the limits of reason. And actually, our show name, Liberty and Logos, is partially a reflection of that. So we talk about Logos as being this multidimensional word. One of the meanings of the word in Platonic philosophy is the part of the soul, the highest part of the soul. And although Plato gets called this paradigmatic figure of rationality, he really was more of a mystic, as were even more so the Neoplatonists who came after him. And they believed, as is a recurring theme in classical metaphysics, as pointed out by the traditionalist school, that there's a faculty higher than reason, and it is something that in Greek is called noesis. In Latin it's called intellectus. There are similar words in other ancient languages. And it's a word that doesn't translate well, but the closest thing we have is something like intuition or sort of mystical insight. And I think this is a higher faculty than reason. So when we try to talk about things in a rational way, for me, that's always in the background, as much as I'm being on point, is this idea that actually there's a higher grasp. And I think that what JD is talking about, to some extent, it is an emotional, instinctive response, but often rebellions in the past, and this has been pointed out by Peter Gelderloos, among others, they often involve some kind of spiritual awakening element. And that's not to say that that necessarily makes them good or well-guided, but I think people get a kind of, and it is a social thing to some extent, because I think sometimes we have these moments where our consciousnesses are not neatly separated, and a kind of group awareness can develop in certain moments when people are harmonizing and in tune. This kind of intuitive, holistic grasp of our situation is not good, it's not healthy, it's not nourishing us, and then these rebellions start, which is why, as I'll talk about in my solo video, I do always have ambivalence about these riots. I don't, it's not that I approve of them and cheerlead them and think that they're wonderful, but on some level I can't totally knock them because, and I have some respect for them because it's people saying, we're in a cage and I don't want to be in the cage anymore. And they realize that on a group level. So.
Yeah, I like that because it shows a middle ground between all of them have thought through their every action, mm-hmm. and all of them are unthinking animals or Pavlovian conditioned subjects and so forth, and allows for, you know, a partial, at least a partly explanatory factor being that there's something going on with a collective unconscious, mm-hmm. because I've never really thought that you know, one group of 10 people go out on the streets and then the rest just follow, as if it was like, you know, they're making their way to Noah's Ark or something, just, oh, where are those guys going? There must be this big spark of where a lot of people decide to do something at the same time in order for these sizable crowds to form. And
yeah, I think it's probably partially telepathic.
Yeah, they're not all just like responding to like a Twitter announcement that says White House lawn 1:00 or anything like that, you know. Mm-hmm. Good.
I guess I want to address the idea that I don't think either of us believes that we can just think our way out of the situation that we're in. It absolutely is going to require a reskilling, a kind of cultural shift that is going to happen through human connections and sort of the reforming of local community ties that are emotional, instinctual, not purely rational. You can't blueprint your way out of this. But I do think that analysis and critique and defacing the currency, which I think is part of what this show is about, is a necessary component, not a sufficient one.
Yeah, I think the final thing I'd add is that, which is something that is definitely non-rational in the absolute sense, and which I want to bring to every discussion I have on this show, is that I think that a spiritual dimension to one's actions is very, very important. And as the episodes go on, I hope to be able to articulate that more and more from different angles.
Mm-hmm.
So the second regular slot, we hope it will become a regular slot, that we want to deal with today is projects that we want to bring to the viewer attention that we have found interesting. I have three for today. Okay. We've been talking a lot, I was talking a lot before in my two coronavirus videos about how this current situation threatens freedom, and I would like to offer as a resource a very good Twitter channel called Lotus Oak, which gives a lot of information about vaccinations, and it is not dealing with some strange angle on all of this. It just puts forward the science. It most often just directly links to scientific studies that show some of the many harmful effects of vaccinations. And I guess what I'm saying is, for those of you that were already skeptical of vaccines, please check it out. And for those of you that think that anti-vaxxers like me are crazy, maybe a challenge. Maybe read some of these scientific papers and see if you are not swayed in some way. The second project that I would like to bring to people's attention, which is more speaking to my existent sort of remaining primitivist instincts, is a group called Survival International, who are an international advocacy group representing the interests of indigenous peoples.
Yes.
And with this, at this time, with such a close focus on what's going on in the inner cities, I think it's always important to keep this not just international view, but kind of cross-cultural view, just to see what is actually happening at where civilization is clashing with primitivity.
Mm-hmm. And even just, I think many people are not aware of the fact that there actually are still people who live extremely traditional ways of life, that even all the way into 2020, which is amazing in terms of that kind of survivalism, and also just amazing to think from a sort of colonized consciousness perspective that there are still these people out there who experience reality in a way that is, I think, profoundly different from ours. So,
and from which we can learn.
And from whom we can learn,
yeah. The third thing I wanted to bring up is not so much a named project, but an idea. On Saturday evening, I attended a discussion group here in Montreal, organized by people who are loosely connected with the local academic world, which was a space in order to have the kind of conversations that may not be possible on university campuses in the sort of public sphere. And it was very, very eye-opening, and I've never really been involved with anything like that. There was about 25 people present. And so really, all I'm trying to pass on, without going into too much detail about it, is maybe the idea that if other people who've been watching this but remaining silent so far wanted to contribute comments, wanted to seek out the possibility of coming on the show, and even to organise their own discussion groups within their own communities. I think those would all be really good ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think although it can seem like such a small thing, I think having those kinds of discussion groups in public spaces where they create a kind of ideational presence that people can see happening are actually really important, because they become the spawning ground for further projects. They provide a space for people to meet each other. They, even on a subtle level, disrupt the sort of normalcy of public spaces like a bar or a cafe. And I think it's one of the only ways that people can find each other in real space, off of the internet, or off of a sort of like a magazine column, letters column or something. So yeah, I'm all for that. I guess I want to put out there too that this is a dialogical project, and we're interested in having people on. You don't have to be some sort of expert or established author, although we will be having people like that on. We also want to have quote unquote normal people on, and especially people who disagree with us. I mean, I think if some of the people who want to project hate in some sort of comment thread wanted to come on and actually hash it out, that'd be great. So.
Sure, sounds great. Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching this episode. Please make sure you check out Bellamy's forthcoming episode on the Chaz, and we'll see you again next time. Okay. Thanks.